Dr. Gamani Corea was best known for being the Secretary General of UNCTAD from I think 1964 to 1984. And what is really interesting about his legacy, especially to students of international relations, especially to them, is that at that time he dared to reimagine a new international world order which recognized inequality between nations and advocated for discriminatory or preferential treatment in the world of trade for those lagging behind. Dr. Corea actually belonged to an illustrious elitist Sinhala family, went to school at Royal College, and had graduate and postgraduate Oxbridge education. So a very unlikely candidate for this reimagining. But despite this traditional neo-colonial upbringing, he was able to imagine a different reality, to think and act outside the proverbial box. Which is why, as we stand today at a political and economic inflection point in Sri Lanka's history, it is important to remind ourselves what his legacy means for us today and for the generations to come. Today we think that the hegemonic hold of a single economic order seems intractable. But it's important that we take courage from the boldness with which Dr. Gamani Corea presented the international community with a blueprint for a new international economic order, an order where, based on North-South cooperation, the developing countries of the Global South would benefit from a reorientation of the international monetary system, from a different set of trade rules, and from the recognition of developing countries' permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. Dr. Corea's vision was not powerful enough to counteract intellectual counter-revolution and fear, I guess, among the world economic powers that a new international economic order would mean dismantling the global market-based economic system. However, even as UNCTAD began to lose some of its teeth, Dr. Corea determinedly went on to build on the solidarity of the G77 group and began to call for greater South-South cooperation via the South Commission and via support to the South Center. So while we celebrate Dr. Corea's vision, determination and courage, I'm really excited to learn more from our esteemed panelists this evening, and I'm grateful to Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara for agreeing to be the moderator for this session. Dr. Vagisha is a political economist, a very versatile political economist, working as the economist today at the UNDP. She obtained her PhD from the University of Purdue in the USA, and has been interested in exploring the interaction between global forms and local political economy of emerging contexts and practices of governance and labor. So thank you very much, Vagisha, for being here. I will invite you to the center stage, as it were, and ask you, and also our panelists, and Vagisha will introduce them and begin this discussion. So thank you, everybody, and I look forward to a very stimulating conversation.
For today's discussion about Gamani Corea, economist, diplomat, and statesman. Dr. Gamani Corea is referred to by many as the embodiment of the confident South. And as Pri also introduced him, he served as the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank and the Secretary of the Ministry of Planning, as well as a distinguished diplomat for Sri Lanka. He's best known as the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development from 1974 to 1984, in which capacity he led multilateral efforts to strengthen the position of developing countries in various areas, including in commodities, debt, and other areas of trade and development, and in the efforts in establishing a new international economic order. His tenure at UNCTAD was underpinned by a vision for the organization as both an intellectual leader as well as a center for serious negotiations on matters of global importance. Debt relief was pushed, the Common Fund was established, the global system of trade preferences among developing countries, GSTP, was launched. Negotiations on a code of conduct for the transfer of technology began, and the discussion on a new international economic order, which is the mothership of all of these initiatives, moved ahead. Now, looking back, this is quite a list of initiatives launched under his leadership. And during Dr. Corea's tenure at UNCTAD, he inspired respect of no less than Henry Kissinger himself, who encouraged Dr. Corea to stay the course no matter what their intellectual and ideological differences might have been. So despite the respect for his work he has earned internationally, many in Sri Lanka don't know about him. They're not familiar with his work. Dr. Gamani Corea's ideas are not taught in schools in Sri Lanka. They're not taught in universities either. So today, in the Festival of Ideas, organized by BCIS, we can reflect, we can take this as an opportunity to reflect on the significance of Dr. Gamani Corea's work in the context of present dynamics in world trade, sovereign debt, and South-South cooperation. So to do that, we have a panel of eminent speakers today, Dr. Indrajit Coomaraswamy, Dr. Dushni Weerakoon, and Dhanusha Pathirana. Please allow me to introduce each of them, and you may come and sit here. Dr. Indrajit Coomaraswamy is the former governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and currently holds positions on the boards of private companies. Previously, he has been a staff officer at the Economic Research, Statistics and Bank Supervision divisions of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Deputy Director at the Ministry of Finance and Planning, Director of the Economic Affairs Division of the Commonwealth Secretariat, and Acting Director of the Social Transformation Program and the Commonwealth Secretariat. He has a DPhil in Economics from the University of Sussex and a BA Honours in Economics from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Coomaraswamy, please come and join us. Dr. Dushni Weerakoon is the Executive Director of the Institute of Policy Studies, IPS, and the head of its Macroeconomic Policy Research Division. She has extensive experience working with the government of Sri Lanka in public policy formulation and advisory capacity, including as an appointed member of the Monetary Board of Central Bank of Sri Lanka and the Board of Investment Sri Lanka. She has also served as a director on boards of corporate and academic entities. Her research and publications cover macroeconomic policy, international economics and trade. She currently serves on the editorial boards of several international peer-reviewed journals. She's the editor of the IPS annual flagship report on the Sri Lankan economy. She holds a BSc in economics with first-class honours from Queen's University of Belfast and an MA and PhD in economics from the University of Manchester. Dr. Weerakoon, please join us. Dhanusha Pathirana is a co-author of A History of Underdevelopment and Political Economy of Inflation in Sri Lanka, published by Macmillan in 2020, and is an independent researcher, political economist, and scholar. Because I know Dhanusha's work from your frequent contributions to papers. Is a regular columnist for the Daily FT and morning newspapers. At present, Dhanusha is a PhD candidate in the Department of Economics at the University of Sri Lanka, and he holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Colombo. Dhanusha, please join us. So today, the discussion is structured in 3 segments, each focusing on a selected theme stemming from Dr. Corea's work. And I mentioned these themes earlier: world trade, debt, and South-South cooperation. This will be followed by a question and answer or comments from the audience. So in each segment, I'll trigger a reflection or pose a question to all three speakers. You can take up to 5 minutes and share your views, and then we'll move on to the next segment. Okay. On world trade segment, the first segment, we'll start on that. Gamani Corea, as a developing country economist, saw that the systems he was dealing with were flawed systems, and that the answer did not lie, as some argued at the time and probably would argue today, in the greater freedom of market and further liberalization, but in the reform of the system towards a more managed, orderly process of equitable growth. He believed that the answers to the problems of development with which the developing countries were grappling could not be found in orthodox economics of the day. This was in the 50s and 60s and 70s. In October 1973, before Dr. Corea had joined UNCTAD, members of the OPEC imposed an oil embargo, sending shockwaves around Western countries, which suddenly felt vulnerable. This promoted a call for more effective international cooperation, which led to intense rounds of negotiations, both outside the UN, at the Paris Conference on International Economic Cooperation, and in the UNCTAD and in the UN. During Dr. Corea's tenure as Secretary General of UNCTAD, he gave leadership to the international efforts to achieve commodity price stabilization in trade. Fluctuations of commodity prices and declining prices had an adverse impact on economic management and planning of developing countries. Dr. Corea's thinking was very much shaped by his experience in Sri Lanka during the 50s and the 70s and the OPEC oil crisis in 73. His thinking led to the establishment of the Integrated Program for Commodities, the IPC, and the Common Fund. The objective of both was to provide both a flow to the downward movement of commodity prices as well as a ceiling, so that at the end there will be a regime of commodity markets which operate and function with greater smoothness, greater regularity and stability. Dr. Corea saw the commodity issue basically as a North-South issue and part of a wider development issue. Now fast forward to 2024. The commodity issue highlighted by Dr. Corea persists. UNCTAD's Trade and Development Report, which is the flagship publication, 2023 one, warns that the global economy is stalling, with growth slowing in most regions compared with last year, and only a few countries bucking the trend. It also says that the global economy is at crossroads, where divergent growth paths, widening inequalities, growing market concentration, and mounting debt burden cast shadows on the future. The prospect of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 is failing, as a combination of rising interest rates, weakening currencies, and slowing export growth, which is squeezing the fiscal space needed for governments to fight climate change and provide for their people. So, let me turn to the panel now and request you to reflect on Dr. Corea's approach to commodity price stabilization in the 1970s and 80s, and share some of your views about the relevance of his approach in the current context of decline in terms of trade, particularly in developing countries. I'll start with Dr. Weerakoon.
Thank you, Vagisha. First of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here. Dr. Corea was the founding chairman of the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. And he held that position from 1990 to 2006. and when I joined the IPS, he was the chairperson and was still very active in talking about trade and all the related work that he had done, and was in the process of writing his memoir. So I'm very pleased that today looking back on some of the work that he has done. Having said that, and coming back to this complex issue of commodity price stabilization, the integrated IPC that he worked on, I think it was Dr. Corea looking for solutions. I think he was very influenced by the British and the Latin American economies at the time. And it started before the oil price shock in 1973. It started in the late 60s. I think Dr. Coomaraswamy will know these details better than me. But the idea was that developing countries were so dependent on primary exports for driving development that this volatility and which then translated into a persistent terms of trade decline meant that we were not going to be able to meet our development goals. Sri Lanka at the time, if you take our economy, and I think his PhD thesis looked at that, tea, rubber and coconut accounted for 90% of our export earnings. So, any decline in terms of trade for those commodities means we are in trouble. So he looked for practical solutions, and I think quite rightly at the time, given the relationships between advanced and developing countries, the advanced countries were the major buyers of commodities at the time. The idea that there can be some kind of an integrated commodity market for these products. But there are problems in that implementation, and that is why it never took off. If you were to have commodity sort of price ceilings, what do you do with excess stocks? Who stocks it? Who pays for it? If you take tea, and even amongst South countries, there were disagreements. India and Sri Lanka were ready to have an agreement on tea, but Kenya said no. They had invested heavily in their tea sector, and they wanted to export as much as they could. So price stabilization means that you have to cap exports also if there is excess production. So in practical terms, implementation was very difficult, and the common fund, I think, was a stumbling block because developed countries had the means, but they were not willing to put money into that fund to help developing countries to pay for stockpiling, etc. Is it relevant today? I think we are still grappling with adverse trade shocks developing countries. Sri Lanka is a case in point. We have not managed to diversify our exports. We are still vulnerable to certain what happens in the external sector impacts us. But I think it is also a little more complex now because the demand for commodities also is coming from the big developing countries. China is an example of that, and they're not only seeking commodities, but they're also looking for commodities like minerals for strategic purposes. So I think 5-6 decades on, the global landscape has changed, as it obviously must, and the solutions that we seek to try and address particular problems that South countries face will not sort of allow us to go back to the 1970s solution and try and fit it into what is happening today. Because there are, of course, conflicts between southern partners as well. But having said that, pioneer in pushing that program of work forward and trying to get southern countries to come together. But I think if he was alive today, he would still be very disappointed in that we have not managed to get to where he was aiming for.
there's an article written by Dr. Gamani on why the implementation of the IPC and the commodity fund did not take off. And precisely for the reasons you're saying, I mean, one reason you mentioned was that even the South, the countries couldn't agree among themselves. I mean, the case about tea illustrates that, right? If anyone's interested in Dr. Kalagama's article, it's republished here in tribute to Gamani Corea. This is a book done by the South Center, an organization that I also worked with, still continue to work with in my capacity at the UN. I'll turn to Dr. Coomaraswamy. Your thoughts on commodity price stabilization?
Let me thank BCIS for inviting me to be part of this panel. To be part of this panel, and really for economists in my generation, Dr. Corea was an iconic and a role model, both for what he achieved nationally as well as internationally, which you went through in your introductory remarks. I think his time at UNCTAD, I think it was particularly notable, and Dushni has spelled out for us the challenges he was trying to address. Because though decolonization started in 1947 with India, even as late as the 1970s, though actually the process had gathered momentum, and much of the many of the colonies had been decolonized, the structures of the global economy had not changed. The patterns of investment and trade, and as Dushni pointed out, the global South continued to be heavily dependent on commodities, and commodity prices over-determined the prospects of these newly independent countries. And there was not only volatility in commodity prices, but a secular decline. Interestingly, if you go to the World Bank's World Development Report of 1982, there is a box on Sri Lanka as a country which had a typical number of countries, but Sri Lanka had been devastated by external trade decline for 20 years. And they give the numbers, but then they give the country the credit for protecting its social indicators despite this significant and dramatic decline in terms of trade. But what that meant was that we didn't have enough surplus to put into our infrastructure, etc. So that's why kind of drove them on that front. We underperformed significantly, despite our capacity to protect the social indicators, despite this type of trade decline. So I think Dr. Corea, from his experience in Sri Lanka initially and international exposure as well, understood this very well. And the people who really started in terms of analytical work, it's questioned the conventional order, or the relic of colonialism, were the people in the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean. Under Raul Pravish, who I think was Dr. Corea's predecessor. And so the dependence theory came up, and then finally there was really a serious questioning of the international economic order as it was, and the fact that it was so heavily tilted against the interests of the global South. And that was really what Dr. Corea was trying to address through all his work and that. And anybody who's heard him speak, he's a wonderfully persuasive and compelling orator. And his strength as in advocating the cause of the global South was what made him such a compelling leader of the collective action. That's the other thing that started for the first time really under him. Though the exact people did sort of good analytical work, what Dr. Corea was able to do was to get collective action. Not enough to kind of break through specific issues. I must share an anecdote on tea. I was Mr. Ronnie DeMille's back carrier in the finance ministry for a while, and he was very keen on talking to the Kenyans about working out some kind of agreement on pricing. And they were extraordinarily generous. They took us on safari, they showed us Kericho, the tea plantation and everything. But they said, our cost of production is about a third less than this. So how does it help us to have a pricing arrangement? So those are the kind of issues that we should talk about. So the process, and another thing that happened, obviously, right, as Dushni implied, you have to have money. You know, essentially for the common fund, and for that you need buffer stocks to be able to manage the prices, etc. So where does this money come from? Now there was some hope those days that OPEC would actually recycle its petrodollars to help the global south. But they would have been to the Western banks, basically. At that time, the US was heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil and was extremely influential in that region. And so there was no way they would go up enough to go outside the Western banks. So that opportunity did not materialize. But the thing that one has to say, though he was not able to achieve his ambitions, the thinking, analysis, and the confidence of the global south was greatly enhanced by Dr. Corea and his work.
Thank you, Dr. Coomaraswamy. You mentioned that Dr. Gamani Corea was a great orator, right? And he's also known for wit, his wit. Evidently, there's a story. Evidently, Dr. Corea was asked to go to Italy and get food aid for Sri Lanka in the 50s. And when he walked into the office, they had looked at him and he looks well fed. And he's a man of great stature, right? And doesn't look undernourished. They have said, you have come to ask for food aid, you don't look malnourished to me. And then so one liner, he says, no, but I represent their aspirations. So I mean, his wit was great. Anyway, now let me turn to Dhanusha.
First of all, let me thank BCIS for inviting me. Timely discussion. Since much was said about Dr. Corea's intervention, so I'd like to say in a few words about how we can relate these ideas to the contemporary situation, and also maybe the contemporary debt problem that we are also facing. And before that, say a few words about this whole the theoretical roots of this idea about terms of trade, and also
just keep it like that. Keep it like that and speak.
how we could
yes.
relate the terms of trade idea to the contemporary situation. So I think the idea of, or the theory of terms of trade goes back or before the period of Previous, the Latin American school of thought in structural economics, which came up in the early 50s, or the development economics field actually came up in the 50s, when the ideas were originating before that, especially in the works of economists like Alfred Marshall, and then later works of Barlow in the US, post-Keynesian or Keynes economics. So they have an idea, it's called what you call the Marshall-Lerner condition, where the aggregate elasticity of exports and imports of a country, if it's say greater than 1, I know it sounds a bit technical, but it's quite simple, the idea. So in that case, market determined exchange rate might not be the best solution for reaching balance of payments or sorting out balance of payments difficulties, because a depreciating currency would not really set off the particular terms of trade which is required to achieve a sustainable inflow of foreign exchange, because the exchange rate in itself will not promote the growth of exports. You know the depreciation, the basic idea is that the depreciation will promote exports and discourage imports. Now this fundamental idea will be violated if the aggregate of these elasticities is less than 1. So which was the case then picked up by economists like Retrospective, looking at the terms of trade data of the former colonies and so to speak the third world or the underdeveloped countries, and to show that, of course, the country's terms of trade are declining. So if you just allow the markets to determine the exchange rate and then let that strike a balance in the external sector, that would not be that would not come up with the optimum result in terms of the availability of capital and resources for those economies. So therefore, they are also prescribed import substitution, that they need to break away from this stagnating or what we call static technology type or labor intensive type area, which Sri Lanka still has managed to specialize or managed to basically dominate its export structure, to break away through non-market methodologies, especially through state intervention. It's not an idea where, like, for instance, maybe someone would describe that to the socialist way of thinking where the role of market is completely wiped out. That's not the case. Where the imperfections in the market is addressed through planned state intervention. Where Gamani Corea is also advocate of this type of thinking. So right now, if we look at Sri Lanka's terms of trade, now recently the Central Bank sector press releases that comes out each month, which has this the index that is calculated. So it's well below 100 of the baseline.
Louder, please. We
So
can't. Hold it close to your mouth.
Mouth.
Hold it close to your mouth. We can't hear you.
So our terms of trade is well below 100. Right now it stands somewhere around close to 90 or even below 90. So that means our ratio of prices from between imports and exports have been declining. That is to say, the unit price of imports have been increasing compared to the unit price of exports during the last, let's say, 25 years. So the problem is very much alive. And if I go even further, if you look at, and in fact, it has intensified. Contrary to what, say, economists like Professor Dr Corea had, in fact, in that article that you just mentioned, Vagisha, Saman Kalagama's article, where Dr. Saman Kalagama quotes Professor. Yes, they are saying that Sri Lanka have been able to break away from this commodity-based exports and go dive into manufactured export, which is completely can be contested, because looking at the composition of manufacturers, our garment sector dominates, and everybody agrees the fact that garments is an extremely labor-intensive sector where the ratio between working capital to fixed capital, or let's say labor to capital, has remained more or less the same over the last 50 years. Maybe the source of energy has changed. Earlier they used to, it was manually powered machines, or right now there's electricity. But apart from that, there is a fixed ratio between the worker and the machine. One person per one machine, and that ratio has remained the same. And if you look at government's contribution to our exports, it has in fact worsened. It was somewhere around 40% in 2011, and has reached around 60% by 2019. And I'm disregarding the figures, the current figures, because there are external shocks and so on that happen, which can distort that ratio. So what you can see is that intensification of Sri Lanka's investment structure into this type of labor-intensive, commodity-driven manufacturing. And also, it's startling also to know that in 2011, our total manufacturing exports were somewhere around $10 billion, which is the same after 10 years. Right now, it's even lesser than that. People can ascribe other reasons. But of course, over a period of 10 years, we can see a significant stagnation of this sector of the economy. So, which means that the market system, as we know in Sri Lanka, markets basically determine most of the allocation of resources, especially when it comes to exports. So these age-old problems still persist. And therefore, we cannot entirely rely on strength of the market forces in determining the future course of capital formation of a country like us.
Yes.
I have a lot of sympathy for what Dhanusha said, but I wonder whether you would agree that the causes of our underperformance have changed to some extent. Whereas, say, in the 70s or the 80s as well, the systemic issues that were constraining us are a bigger problem than domestic policies. Now, there are lots of countries who have now, they basically industrialized and gone up the value scale, and completely transformed their economy. Whereas we haven't. That's because I think, in a sense, we have had an anti-export bias in our policy. So in the balance between systemic issues and weak domestic policies, that has changed. That we've missed opportunities that are out there because our policies in relation to exports have not been as good as other countries. So that's I think that's why you said even between 2011 and now, we've seen manufactured exports coming down.
Do you want to respond to that very quickly? And we'll move on to the next.
Yes, well, I would agree with that, let's say, 50%. Well, I say 50% is that, yes, the policies have not been in place, but what are these policies we are talking about? So the countries you would mention, say, for instance, like South Korea, Taiwan, they did not go by the standard IMF or World Bank policies, which is the set model of policies for developed countries to come out of their economic stagnation that they are currently facing. So like I said earlier, because very much state-driven initially, the investment field and where the investments were going into which industries, that were all determined, and the state played a huge role in it. So yes, I agree with you when I say yes, the policy framework was not there. But then again, if you forget about the policy framework, the neoclassical thinking, economic thinking, I would say neoclassical economic thinking, the neoliberal form of political economic thinking that predominates in this part of the world, even actually reflects some of the progressive aspects of neoclassical economics itself, because it allows for market failure. And in the case of market failure, it allows government intervention. But when it comes to neoliberal policy, it doesn't actually take up those insights that actually are there even in the mainstream economic thinking. Instead allows a market-driven system or policy centered on allowing the markets to determine where the resources are flowing. So this was our policy in general in a couple of sentences. But the experience of the countries which you just mentioned, like for instance in Asia, they completely broke away from this system. For instance, there is a paper published in 1999 by the Oxford Economic Papers, the journal. It was also republished by the Princeton University. They came up with this idea to theorize actually what happened in the East Asian experience, like Taiwan, South Africa. Am I making 2 minutes? So they came up with this idea called dynamic comparative advantage, as opposed to static comparative advantage, which in fact now dominates when it comes to trade deal. So these theoretical insights have not made it into the policy framework, even in the mainstream, even when it comes to theoretical developments in the mainstream. So one comparative advantage, dynamic comparative advantage, is trying to say, look the experience of, for instance, like South Korea, let's say POSCO, that is the South Korean steel industry, was set up in the early 70s, disregarding the advice of the World Bank. For instance, World Bank said, look, you have very small home market. You should focus on specializing in your own comparative advantage. Where that is heavy intensive type of manufacturing. This is a heavy industry, you are going to go and fail. It's going to work and don't sound quiet, but they completely disregard all that. Except that is nonsense. When we had invested, the state invested $3.5 billion into the steel industry of South Korea. Later it was taken up by the private sector. So the entire structure of the economic system was transformed entirely by planned state intervention, but not just ad hoc. Here and there, like you put it like big shops, but these are integrated industries. One industry leads to the output of another industry. So likewise, the industrial structure was integrated so as to overcome the indivisibility problem in a limited home market. So that's another concept. So
I'm not asking for a federal or
Louder, please.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not arguing for neoliberal or neoclassical. All I'm saying is our policy framework, our state basically set in place policies that push resources into the sectors of the domestic economy. That was the problem. The successful countries in East Asia had a framework which eventually somehow incentivized the external market. In our case, we consistently incentivize the domestic market. That's why I feel I have no issues about industrial policy. That's the wrong industrial policy.
I saw Professor Siriman seated at the edge of his seat, wanting to say something. So I'm hoping in the question and answer session that you'll express your views about the discourse that we are triggering here. Let me thank you all for that stimulating discussion. I think I see a lot of wheels turning in the audience, so I hope this provides really good ammo for the discussion later on. Segment 2, we thought we'd focus segment 2 on Dr. Corea's advocacy and ideas on developing countries' debt. This work is lesser known in global circles, but it's quite significant. He's written extensively on it. As Secretary General of UNCTAD, Dr. Corea pushed for the release of developing countries in the form of retroactive adjustment of terms of past loans. He broadened the scope of UNCTAD's work, and he made UNCTAD's presence felt in the Interim Committee and Development Committee, where he supported the view that the monetary system should be balanced and adequately underpinned so as to meet effectively the requirements of development. He argued forcefully for the link between allocations for special drawing rights and development assistance. The 1978 resolution number 165 was a major departure from traditional stance of credit donations and opened the road later on to the so-called heavily indebted poor countries to HIPIC initiative by the Bretton Woods institutions. He provided intellectual leadership to establishing guidelines for debt-free scheduling, thorny issue then as well. There was a major breakthrough though, since the debt-free negotiations in multilateral fora, mainly the Paris Club, were expected to move away from the traditional, short leash approach that they otherwise used to, perhaps still do, and were pushed to move away from that approach and adopt a balanced mix of policy measures that would take into account the interests of creditor countries as well as the development requirements of the developing countries seeking debt relief. The negotiating position, this is an interesting thing, I didn't know this actually. Negotiating position of the developing countries were further enhanced by the participation of UNCTAD in Paris Club negotiations. Despite many of these achievements in supporting debt relief of developing countries, Dr. Corea worried about the exposure of many developing countries to capital markets. under conditions of global uncertainty, he worried that it may lead to systemic debt crisis with serious repercussions on the development process. He felt that his work was incomplete in this area because the efforts did not succeed in introducing the debt problems of developing countries as an established feature of the system itself, the finance system itself. He argued that his approach tends to place undue emphasis on the misguided, that this approach, probably the current approach as well, he places undue emphasis on misguided domestic policies and ignores that the debt crisis may indeed be an upshot of malfunctioning of the international financial system. In such circumstances, debt becomes pervasive and requires a broad approach which surpasses the confines of a case-by-case treatment, which we have now. There was not, and even today there is not, an institutional framework to deal with debt crises. This is especially the case with debt obtained from capital markets. We fail to engage capital markets and hold them accountable to an intergovernmental institution for their actions, which should be consistent with international norms and development and stability. These are the things that Dr. Corea pushed for. So my request to the panelists is this. Now, Dr. Corea's work on debt relief of developing countries was premised on principles of fairness and justice in line with international norms. And resolving debt crisis was not simply about settling accounts with creditors, but how to do it in a way that development of a country is not compromised. Perhaps not in the mainstream, but there are strong voices, both local and international, that point out that Sri Lanka could have negotiated for a better deal in debt restructuring. What are your thoughts about this? I'll start with Dr. Coomaraswamy and then.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So in terms of Dr. Corea's own work on that, I think I'm not aware of anybody else who actually spoke about a systematic treatment of sovereign debt in terms of relief on sovereign debt. I'm not aware of anybody else who has written or spoken about it. So it was seminal work. And I would say one thing. I think that there have been frameworks, multilaterally agreed frameworks to assist low-income countries. But so far we haven't had any such framework for middle-income countries. And I think that's something we need to remember when we look at ourselves and the treatment we're getting. So I think you can draw a straight line from Dr. Corea's work to the Toronto terms that the G7 countries approved at their summit in Toronto. I think it was something like 86, 87, somewhere around, in the second half of the 1980s, whereby there was a structured approach to writing down the official bilateral debt of low-income countries, basically. So basically it was ODA, which was being written down. So that was the first time there was any, and really the intellectual genesis, I think, we would trace back to Dr. Corea's work. There's now a framework that was set up. And then after that, you got the HIPIC initiative, which dealt with the multilateral in the early 90s. So these were really, I think, one claim and quite in a justified way, that these were extensions of Dr. Corea's thinking. In the case of countries who needed it most, the low-income countries. But there was no framework for market access countries. The Latin American debt crisis was settled through the Brady bonds. Basically, the U.S. government underwrote these bonds, which bailed out the U.S. banks, which had led to the Latin American countries and the crisis. but no framework. It was case by case basis. But we have had these frameworks for low income countries. And now again it's the same. So we've gone from Toronto terms to ITIC, and now we've got the common framework for low income countries, which was agreed by the G20. Now it's been moved from the G7 to the G20. G20 agreed this framework, under which they are now giving assistance to the low income countries. But there is criticism even of that framework. It's been very cumbersome, slow, and there's even a question as to whether enough relief is being provided. So that when the Ghanas and the Zambias come under that category. So our practice of comparing ourselves with Ghana and Zambia is comparing apples with oranges. Because market access countries or middle income countries are expected to be able to carry a heavier load of debt. Because they have higher level of saving, they have stronger financial systems. For these reasons, the assumption is they can carry a heavy load of debt. Therefore, the write-down or the haircut that creditors need to take would be less, because these countries are in a position to fend for themselves in a more robust way. But, so, okay, one thing is, in my view, there should be a framework for middle countries as well. So that's one area. I mean, no, let's go back. So we need to improve what the common framework for all. We need to have a framework for middle income market access countries. Where we have an okay, so then we were asked the question, has Sri Lanka done as well as it can within this framework? Right? The framework is not something we can change on our own. And there is a chatter that even the IMF doesn't think that the framework for market access countries is adequate. But once they introduce a framework, they don't change it until there is some evidence-based compulsion for doing so. So they're not going to do it for a couple of years. And we will get into it. We were the first country for this market access framework. So, okay. Now, once this framework is put in place, the basis is under this framework, rather, but it's not a framework, under this process that is currently available for market access countries, the IMF DSA basically sets the path to that sustainability. Then the IMF does not get involved at all, and the debtors and the creditors negotiate. What the IMF then does is, once the deal is struck, it certifies whether or not the deal is sufficient to get the country onto the path of that sustainability that is laid out in the macro-fiscal framework that is laid out in the IMF's DSA. So when people say, okay, we could have done better, the question in my mind is, now we are going through the process. We did the domestic debt restructuring, then the official one, and then once the commercial one was done, the first framework, or the first deal, was proposed by the creditors, by the bondholder committee. And that, the IMF said, was not sufficient to get us onto the debt sustainability path. Then the government of Sri Lanka came up with a counter proposal, which the IMF had said now gets us onto that path of debt sustainability. Now, I don't see how you can get the commercial creditors to agree to a deal which goes beyond what the IMF says gets you debt sustainability. So that's the limitation. We are not in a strong position, right? We defaulted. So, in that position, and the IMF is the neutral arbiter. They don't negotiate. They set the, we can argue about the process, the framework that they're using to calculate the DSA, but that is what they're using. So, from the Sri Lankan perspective, at this point, we need to accept that. We have no choice but to accept that DSA path that's been made out. And once the creditors have agreed to a deal, which the IMF says is sufficient for us to get on a path with sustainability, then for us to turn around and say, look, you guys have not got a good enough deal, doesn't matter. So let me say this. So what am I trying to say? One, we need to strengthen the framework of the World Convention. We need to have a framework which we don't have for market access countries. A multilaterally agreed framework, right? The IMF has a framework, but not a multilaterally agreed framework, like a common framework. We need to have a multilaterally agreed framework. And then I think we also need basically, essentially, the more the international system needs to have the capacity for counter-cyclical liquidity, which is what Dr. Corea was talking about the SDRs. We do not, the system does not have it. Except under intense crisis, just now under during the pandemic, the IMF issued $650 million worth of SDRs, and we got 800 million partial. During the global financial crisis, again, there was an issue. So they do it only when there is a systemic shock. But what Dr. Corea was saying was use the SDRs, let the IMF be the anchor of last resort, and use the SDRs to provide counter-cyclical relief, so that the blend of financing and adjustment and the financing and austerity will be less significant. Right? So we need that.
I think the challenge for all of you is to speak louder, because of the rain and the noise. Let me now pose the same question to Dhanusha, because I know you have been writing on this topic.
Well, I would like to disagree with Comaraswamy on two accounts. One thing, the historical experience of countries which were with a much more significant, meaningful gap in terms of Lanka and also these interest rates. And just stick to that. And also the argument that you have proposed in terms of the DSA. So if I just first start off by saying a few words about the history. Loud enough?
You can turn your chair. You can turn the chair, it might help. Turn to face a little bit.
So if you take the example of say Argentina, back in 2005, Ecuador in 2009, and then again even Nigeria more recently, and take the example of Greece, for instance, which is not even a low-income country. I think it's categorized as probably a high-income country. So these economies, sorry if I don't bring up enough examples, but there are plenty I have in fact written about this. So these countries have managed to get significantly large haircuts, despite the fact that they are categorized as middle-income countries or even countries that are having a much higher per capita income. So they have adopted different routes, but underlying premises on which they argue with the creditors have been more or less the same. But let me, before going into that, try to reflect on this idea about the DSA and what Dr. Coomaraswamy said about the fact that you cannot compare with Ghana. Ghana is lower down the line in terms of the per capita income, so they have maybe structures that are inferior to, say, for instance, Sri Lanka. So they are that stabilizing ratio of debt to GDP can be lower than that of Sri Lanka, and so on. Now, if we actually look into the actual debt sustainability framework done by the World Bank and the IMF, which has been periodically updated since its launch in April 2005, which is available in the website. So they have updated this back in 2023. So according to that, they consider an economy with a debt to GDP ratio, including the present value of the debt also. So that is to say, you take the interest payments into the future and discount it with whatever percentage you like. Say inflation, say 5%. And add that up on top of the outstanding debt. So it is larger than the stock of debt. Now they say if the IMF determines your ratio as 70%, which means that is an economy with a significantly high, strong capacity to repay debt. And an economy with a system or incomes that are much more inferior, they would rank, a country with, let's say, a weak capacity to pay debt will be a ratio somewhere around 35%. So the highest level they are saying it's like 70%. So what is the ratio which IMF ascribed to Sri Lanka? They said in 10 years time, which is a long period of time, from 2022 to 32. By 32, if you reach 95% of debt to GDP ratio, of total outstanding debt, even excluding the present value of the interest payments. So if you reach 95%, you will be okay. They didn't say you will be brilliant, but they said you will be fine at 95%. Now this is on one hand a distortion of their own criteria. If you look at their own standards, they, for instance, say for low-income countries, if we determine that you're sustainable at 70% of your present value of the debt, that means you have a very strong economy. Now they have declared 95% to Sri Lanka, excluding the present value of debt. That means it's almost as if doubled, or maybe 70 or 60% greater than their top limit. So what this does, like what Dr. Coomaraswamy said, when IMF comes up and set up the DSA, that lays down the path for later debt renegotiation. So what would the creditors say? Look at the IMF is saying you are 95% is fine. You're already at something like 110%. So you don't need a haircut, and that you only need to reach by in next 10 years. So if your GDP keeps on growing, let's say 3-4%, you might not even need a haircut. So, and that is what has happened in these discussions. So IMF has been distorting their own criteria in a way that actually benefits the creditors when a country like us goes into the negotiation table, because the capacity for us to go and negotiate and demand for a higher debt haircut completely thrown out of the table when the DSA says you are fine by 95%. And then, just to reiterate this point, now even if you go to a commercial bank, let's say to get a loan, that bank would look into your past, whether you have actually piled up a mountain of debt already, and whether you have an income source to pay the debt. And if you borrow even more, what would happen to you? Whether you would collapse. That is because the lender himself takes responsibility in the repayment process. Now let's take the example of a housing loan. The bank would even give the next tranche if you haven't used the initial installment according to the terms of the contract. So now what has happened in terms of not just Sri Lanka, the third world debt altogether. Now these institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have set these criteria so that the lenders can understand whether these institutions or the governments have the capacity to repay. So you cannot absolve from the responsibility of the lenders also in this. Because if I again go back to the banking example, a rule of thumb in commercial banks is that the amount of capital, let's say for a personal loan, they would say a 1-to-1 ratio of your annual income will be lent to you as the capital portion in your loan. So, but when it comes to, let's say, the Sri Lanka, we had, let's say, 100% debt GDP ratio maybe in 2015-16. Yes, around around that time, I forget the exact, let's say 100%. And we had a revenue, government revenue close to 10%, 10 to 12%, which means your amount of debt, the stockpile of debt is something like 10 times of your annual revenue. So while all these, criteria has been violated, the lenders have to keep on, piling up debt into this region, not just Sri Lanka. I would specify that into the third world, completely piling up because they would know, end of the day, these governments do not vanish, and the governments have the capacity to somehow tax the population, disregarding the conditions of living, poverty, rates of poverty. They could actually report the public and somehow pay. So going back to the discussion on the IMF and whether we can renegotiate, I think yes, taking from examples of countries like Argentina, Ecuador, Nigeria, and even Ghana. For instance, Ghana was proposed a disastrous debt deal by the creditors, which the IMF did not really, mind. But the Ghana government said, look here, we cannot repay an amount greater than what we already borrowed. After restructuring, this amount, the stockpile should come down. But in the case of Sri Lanka, what has happened is that we were supposed to pay, including interest, 16.3 billion by 2030. This is including the interest payments. But what has happened now, yes, there is an extension of the maturity period, but on top of the 16.3, we have to pay additional 2.3 billion if our average GDP surpasses 107 billion, or additional 2 billion if our average GDP passes 99 billion between 2025 and 27. So that also highlights the fact that I'm running out of time, just finishing up. So that also finally shows that the reduction in the GDP is 8 billion in the parameters. It's huge, but the reduction in the terms of payment is negligible. So you are reducing from 18.3 to 18 billion, less than that. So it does not reflect the capacity to repay. So there are lots of issues, and also I disagree there where the government had been like sort of, their proposal was significantly different from what the creditors was proposing. This was even ironically stated by Dr. Nishan Dimel in April. Look, there is not much of a difference between what the government and the creditors have proposed. So they should be able to sort the differences out, and we should consider the deal is done. He said this back in April in a program that I was taking part. So there is clear, you cannot rule out the fact that there was some sort of collusion when it comes to who would benefit out of this, like whether it's the Sri Lankan public or the creditors.
Thanks, Dhanusha. I will turn to Dr. Weerakoon. You don't have to answer the
initial question I posed. You can also respond to what was said by Dr. Coomaraswamy and Vagisha.
I'm going to take this session in two parts. One is the International Financial Architecture fair? No. It's not. And that is something that Dr. Corea was trying to work on in terms of debt crises that countries have been, developing countries have been subject. Why is the international architecture not fair? Because we don't have a kind of a framework to resolve this situation. Look at the World Bank IMF. The World Bank always has to be headed by American, if I'm not mistaken, IMF by European, all stitched up quite nicely. If you go into debt restructuring, multilateral lending is not on the table for restructuring. Why is that? World Bank, etc. So it is not a, I would say, whatever the 60s, 70s, we are still facing and any improvements, getting the deputy director positions at the IMF to be non-European and non-American, I think that took more than a decade. So this is the system in which we have to function. Now, I don't necessarily take the point that all our problems are something that is external. We have to also take responsibility for our mistakes, right? If you take the highly indebted country episode, that was manageable because the lending was done by banks. When you say it's commercial borrowing that those countries did, the main lender were the banks. That is why the US stepped in, issued bonds, because they didn't want the banking sector to fall into any trouble. We are now in a very different set of circumstances. If we are borrowing overseas from international capital markets, we are borrowing from pension funds, hedge funds. These are the international sovereign bond. They are dispersed. You can't easily negotiate with them. They will refuse to come to the table. They will instead go and file a lawsuit. Argentina is a repeat defaulter. What's the other country that you mentioned? Repeat defaulter in Ecuador, right? So Sri Lanka here, we are going into a debt restructuring. We have a very complex set of creditors in terms of the geopolitics of what is happening in this world today. China, non-Paris Club. India, non-Paris Club. Japan, in the Paris Club, and bond holders, mostly US investors. And that is why we have seen through the last 2 years, the Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and the Americans wanting our ports, our energy sector. These are all negotiation that's ongoing related to our debt restructuring talks. We are in a weak position, and I think we are at fault for getting ourselves into that position. Because nobody put a gun to our heads and said, go and borrow. We did, and we didn't have the institutional frameworks to manage that debt responsibly, right? First point. Now, could we have done a better deal? If you look at the literature out there about default crisis episodes, the World Bank has this, cookie cutter. They have a template, a database of, let's say, 170 episodes. Some are repeat episodes, Argentina, all of that. And they will pull out these numbers and say, this is the debt sustainability analysis for Sri Lanka, 95% of GDP by such, and that has been disputed by creditors as well, that we will, even if we get to 95% of GDP, we are not out of the debt crisis. Now, the question is, if we ask for higher haircuts, negotiations take much longer. Look at the literature. 5 years is your average time for concluding negotiations when you have to deal with official bilateral creditors like China. China is not obliged to come on board because we are not a country under the G20 debt treatment framework. Sri Lanka is middle income. They don't have to participate, but China has come into the G20 framework. When you are negotiating with China, you have to negotiate with Exim Bank of China, the what is the other one? The China Development Bank, government of China separately. Then India will look at what are you giving the Chinese? Are we getting the same thing? Right. On the bondholders, the issue is if we go to ask for deeper haircuts and we prolong our restructuring number of years, the economic recovery is much slower. I mean, there's plenty of literature out there that maps all of that and says you can ask for 50% haircut. It might just mean that you drag on in that time. You are still under default status. Your private sector cannot borrow. It means the recovery is going to be that much more painful. So a government has to take a decision on trade-offs. Do we give something but get a deal done more swiftly that will allow the Sri Lankan economy to recover. Look at our recovery, 4% this year, GDP growth. IMF forecast for the year is 2.2%, and they refuse to lift that forecast. Because when they run their 160 country examples in their database, no country that has gone through a default has recovered to 4% growth. So double their estimate. That's not to say we will maintain that 4% growth, because we are still coming from negative 3% in 2023. But still, the recovery has been much better than what we expected. So the pros and cons of if we do better on the GDP growth, we also have a small haircut on the macro-linked bonds. So, it is not black and white to me. There are a lot of issues involved. But the lesson that I take from this, and I hope that the lesson that we as a country have learned, is that we should just stop blaming everybody else and look at where we are, because even lenders who lend to us did not anticipate that Sri Lanka's tax revenue to GDP ratio would fall to 8% when they lent. And that's a self-inflicted wound. So I think if we put in place, at least now, the Independent Debt Management Office, where they will look at all of the ways in which, even if we borrow, where are we going to invest those funds, what is the return on those funds that allow us to repay, then we've learned something from this crisis. If not, I think we will also be another repeat defaulter in 2 years.
Hello, sorry. Just a couple of things if I may, respond to Dhanusha. One thing is sort of a factual thing. I think there was only one occasion when Sri Lanka's debt to GDP went over 100%. And that was, I think, about 2002, the time, the Air Force bombing and the economy. The only year the economy had negative growth before the recent crisis. And it was around 85%. I think that was a peak. The second thing is, I think it's important to focus on the debt to GDP, but we need to look at all three indicators in the debt service, in the IMF DSA framework and the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. External debt servicing comes down from 8% to 4.5 at the end of this. So that's a pretty significant in terms of the actual outflow from the country, it almost halved. Second thing is that the GFM, the gross financing needs of the country, come down from 34% of GDP to 13%. These are very big adjustments, right? The debt to GDP is so high because primarily of domestic debt. And we did such a light adjustment of domestic debt, simply because the financial system was under threat. At that time, everybody was convinced we were going to have a banking crisis on top of everything else. And so they left the primary dealers, many of whom are linked to banks, out of the process. I mean, that's been heavily criticized. But that's the decision that the government took, because it didn't want to put the banking system under threat at a time when the IMF and the World Bank were convinced. So much so that the World Bank has given us $150 million, I think, Dushni, correct me if I'm wrong, $150 to put into the deposit insurance scheme. Because they thought, we're going to have to pay out because the banks were going to have a crisis. So because we didn't adjust the domestic debt, that debt to GDP number is pretty high. So the outcome is, if you want to look at only the debt to GDP, it has come down. But if you look at all three indicators, in terms of the outflow, in terms of the cash flow outflow for external debt servicing, and the government's requirements, the financing requirements, both of those come down significantly. So I think you have to look at the full picture, and still I think the framework that the IMF is using for the first time on Sri Lanka as a market access country is a given for us. Unless, that doesn't mean we should stay quiet. In case we have to go there again in 2028 or 2029 to restructure, now we need to lobby and make sure that framework, through the B24 and various other fora where we have a voice, we should lobby with other countries to get this improved. The framework is not good, there is no doubt about that. But within that, to say that our folks negotiated with the show, I don't accept that. Because once the IMF has set the path using a framework which gives us a suboptimal outcome in my view, then it is very difficult then to go to the creditors and say you have to give us more. But the IMF is seen as a neutral arbiter in this process. So I really don't accept that my former colleagues really have not done as good a job as they could. They've done what they could. They've got us onto that sustainable path.
Dhanusha, would you like to respond, and then we'll close the loop and move on to the next segment?
Yeah, I would like to respond to, I think, about 5 points made there. First, I would like to start off by saying about the recovery as such that, we made to believe. Now, if you look at the debt repayment starting, imagine now, given the fact, the condition that we strike this deal by the end of December, then our repayments start the following year, right? And then on top of that, we have to lift the import controls on personal vehicles. And just to remind you all, back in 2018, when there was no accumulated pent-up demand, we imported 1.6 billion worth of personal vehicles alone. This is not to use for tourism and so on. It's for personal transportation purpose. 1.6 billion there itself. And then, assuming the fact that we strike this deal by December, we have a past due interest bond to pay, a plain vanilla bond with an interest rate of 4%. And past due interest is right now 1.9 billion and 24 million as of October this year. So, and they are going to give a haircut on that of something like 11%. But when you pay that with 4%, it exceeds the 1.9 million. Now you have to start paying that, repay that loan, the PDI, the vanilla bond. And on top of that, we have to service the interest not only on the ISPs. So we have ISPs excluding the PDI, something like 12.5, so including the PDI, we have 14.5 total as capital in ISPs. Now on top of that, then we have to start servicing the bilateral debt also. Not the capital portion, but the interest of 2%. That will come up to again another 200 million. And again, we have another commercial borrowing of 4 billion with China, which still have not been negotiated. So we have interest spending on that also when the deal is finalized. All this comes to roughly $2 billion, excluding the what I'm saying, the personal vehicles imports expenditure we have to expect. So we are expecting additionally minimum 3.5 billion worth of expenses next year compared to this year, right? And on top of that, if you look at what is happening to our imports. Now our imports, monthly imports was roughly around 1.4 billion for the last 2.5 years. Now since June and July, this has shot up to 1.7 billion already, while the import ban in place on vehicles, and the fact that the vehicles that are now about to come onto the roads are not so far consuming the fuel imports that are also would go up next year. And in the case of an external shock, a mild external shock onto the oil prices, now it's selling at around $70 per barrel. Imagine the conflict situation in Ukraine or wherever erupts in the Middle East. You see the barrel of oil going beyond $80 per barrel, and which about 2 years ago central bank said if the price of oil goes beyond 80, we are in trouble. And right now it's 70. So there is all that possibility is also there, and there's on top of that an unceremonious ban or advisory on traveling to Sri Lanka would make matters even worse. So we have 3.5 billion worth of 2 billion waiting for as debt repayments because of this deal. Now we are saying because we have expedited the process, now we are out of trouble. This is what I'm contesting, which is not true. We are back in trouble towards the end of the next year or starting the following year, precisely because of this deal. Because we will have to service somewhere around 2 billion in additional debt in terms of interest and the past due interest bond. On top of that, we have to start importing all these vehicles. We have to completely remove the ban on the imports on the vehicles. That means minimum 1.5 billion. Minimum, because now people are just waiting to get into their new vehicles and just drive across. So that means you are reducing your savings ratio in the system. Moving into consumption rather than advancing your capital stock. So there you go on that. So and the other thing is that I'm not advocating repeated defaults. I'm just taking one example, and Ecuador is this. It defaulted 2 times. Now I can go into the arguments they were using to get this type of a significant haircut, whereas our former colleagues were not making. So they specifically were highlighting that what Dr. Dushni said, the responsibility of the borrower. Now what we have to see here is that the government borrows on behalf of a public which has zero control over this money. So there is what we call in economics, there is a third person's using someone else's money that we show. So then there should be systems in place to ensure that these funds are properly used. So what those governments said was, look here, the former governments have not been using this money for the benefit of the public. And there is clear evidence of that. Now if you go into the US law, New York law, or rather the US district law, this is clearly stated. If a particular country borrows and that particular government uses that money not for the benefit of the public, and also that you cannot say that the creditor was not aware of this. 2 conditions have to be met. If these 2 conditions are met, on top of that, if that debt was used to, let's say, suppress democratic rights of the people. Say, for instance, our Tamil community, now we were borrowing for the war. So now the Tamil community has to pay back the debt that was borrowed to suppress them. Now is that justifiable? So these conditions are made into the law, especially in the US District Court, that a country, a new government represented by the people can actually demand higher cuts for the reason that the creditors were also well aware that these things are happening in these countries or by the government. So that through that argument, the new governments can actually ask for a higher haircut, and the legal provisions are there. This is what exactly Argentina and Ecuador did. And I've spoken to people who actually were doing that hands-on, especially Ecuador and Argentina. So this is the argument they were using with the creditors, and creditors had to comply because there is legal provision. So they didn't actually go to courts in both these cases, except for in Argentina on one case where some also funds were tested, but that was an isolated case. Not the 90% of the creditors agreed to the restructuring program. And
correct.
Sure. I've been given strict instructions by the organizers that we have to finish by 6, so 2 minutes for you.
I have some difficulty with the numbers, I have to say, because I do not think that the report was
Louder, please.
It was high at that time because the duties were lower. The UMP government wanted to give its supporters a chance to import vehicles. Yeah, it was there. But I'm saying, yeah, I don't think it will be repeated because, one, people are now paying 36% tax. Yeah, there is a 10% pent-up demand, and while you can't put quantitative restrictions, you can put sky-high duties. We have treaty obligations with the WTO and also I think Article 6 of the IMF, which doesn't allow us to use quantitative restrictions. But there is no reason why you can't have absolutely sky-high tariffs, duties, and also now, hopefully the RMB through the RAMI system is reporting every time somebody buys a high-value car, then it comes into Indian revenue. So people, not only they have to pay 36% tax, if they have not been doing that, they will get caught up. So they'll be very reluctant now, I think, to go and spend their money on cars, because they're going to get caught up in the revenue net. So that number is not going to come at 1.6. And to the best of my knowledge, the way I look at this debt restructuring arrangement, we have kind of been put in an oxygen tank for till 2028. Because we have, so multilateral debt we've been paying, will continue to pay. On official debt, to the best of my knowledge, Dushni, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think we have a moratorium on both interest and capital, I think. But, that's right? We have moratorium till 2028. On commercial debt, in January we have to, if the deal is done, in January we have to start paying interest on commercial debt. And there's a past due interest as well. So, from what I haven't been working on these things, so I don't know, but from what I can make out, the number is somewhere around $1 billion. And there is no way more vehicle imports are going to be anywhere near 1.6 billion. Because I think the wealthy would be that scared to go and spend money the way they did before. This time they get caught up with the IRB, and they're paying 36% tax now. So I think affordability will be an issue, and the people in the middle still have an affordability problem. So they're not going to go and buy cars in the way they were in 2018. So I don't think motor vehicles are going to be at that number. So we have this oxygen that we are in. We've till 2028. We have relief on total bilateral payments and on capital payments on ISPs. But in 2028, if we haven't got ourselves into shape to pay all the debt and finance our imports, we're back to square one. Then we'll have to go for another debt restructuring and another package of austerity. So that's why you have to get the growth.
Next one,
I
please.
think we can maybe hold that thought. Maybe during the Q&A we can come back. Sorry? All right, let's move on to the last segment of this discussion. I can already see stimulated debate or a discussion at the end of this segment as well. The concept coined by Dr. Gamani Corea, which I remember most, applicable to my work currently and previously, is the word development consensus. In 1985, he described the need for such a consensus, and I'd like to quote from Dr. Corea's writing. He says, quote, "The motivating factors now are not only the political need to respond to the problems of newly emerging nations or the humanitarian compulsion to alleviate poverty and reduce the widening gap between rich and poor countries. There is now also the need for a framework of international economic relations which provide for the maximum utilization of mutually reinforcing and interacting forces for growth and prosperity throughout the world economy. The underlying theme for systems adaptation must be the incorporation of a development consensus comparable to the full employment consensus which was written into post-war systems. This is not, by any means, a sectional interest of developing countries. It's an imperative for the world economy and hence for the developed countries as well." End quote. Now, Dr. Corea emphasized that a development consensus would require a systematic change in the framework of international trade, both in commodities and manufactures, guaranteeing developing countries stable and increasing commodity export earnings, and temporarily preferential market access to the industrial products is essential, according to him. He talked about closing the gap between developing countries of the South and industrialized countries in the north, and the need for structural change in 7 areas: trade, money, finance, debt, insurance, transport, and technology. In the terminology of the 1970s, this was referred to as the new international economic order. Dr. Corea called for developing countries to stick together, to intensify economic cooperation amongst them, and to attain some form of collective self-reliance. In his view, this was not in conflict with the need to reach consensus. Dr. Corea did not advocate Southern collective self-reliance as a fallback answer to a lack of response from the North to the demands of development cooperation. He foresaw that growing production surpluses in the South could not be absorbed solely by the North. So he considered economic cooperation between developing countries as an imperative for the good functioning of the future world economy, and therefore an objective in which developed countries themselves have an important stake. Dr. Corea foresaw that an international development consensus is crucial if we want to run the system, rather than the system running us. Such a warning may have been perceived as a doomsday sermon back in the day, rather than an intellectual analysis of trends in the world economy, but we know better now. Global accumulated market power has become footloose, beyond the control of most individual countries. This is the situation in the banking industry, the arms industry, in sectors of energy, food, chemicals and pharmaceuticals, and also in large segments of commerce, services and entertainment. During the decades of 1970s and 80s, negotiating parties could perhaps be excused for not following a rationale for consensus and common interest as put forward by Dr. Corea and also Willy Brandt. However, presently there is no excuse whatsoever anymore. So, request to the panelists again. With the emergence of BRICS and the G20 as major actors in the world economy and in international economic diplomacy, what are the prospects of Dr. Gamani Corea's new international economic order and development consensus becoming a reality? And a related question is, how should Sri Lanka engage with these emerging formations globally? I'll start with Dhanusha.
So I think we have to improvise a little bit on the term of trade argument, that it is limited to looking at the prices and trying to balance out the stocks. It did not really work. So, but then the underlying condition between the terms of exchange cannot be just understood by looking at the differences in the way prices behave. Like, I think, to take an idea from late Professor S.P. De Silva of Sri Lanka's political economics, one of the ideas he shared with me was, see, look at, there is a significant disparity when it comes to payment of wages for equal work done in, say, the global south and in the developed capitalist core. Say, take an example, let's say a garbage collecting worker works for 1 hour, does an equal amount of work there here. But the real payment for that labor, the difference between the real payment, probably about 20, 15 times. So this itself feeds into the lower prices, because countries in the global south, the more labor intensive exporters, so the cost structure of our exports is dominated by wages. Now when wages are paid a fraction of the price which is paid in the developed world, obviously that means not just the wages are low, the amount of capital that comes into the region also goes down. So the amount of capital, the volume of capital that is required to, let's say, transform the economy into other areas become deficient within the system of global trade. So, as a result, countries like Sri Lanka are pushed onto the global debt market to borrow to finance that form of that. We obviously would not say that the capital formation has happened in the correct areas, but regardless of that, in order to get that capital into the country, that should have come through the payments for labor, wages, not the price itself, but the wage itself is paid into the prices. Now that actually limits the volume of capital that should come into the region. As a result, the region has to depend on debt. So I think rather than trying to balance these prices, because the price, working on the price system is, there's so much going to it, and then there is so much of differences when it comes to commodities. It would be rather, I won't say that it is an easy task, but comparatively easier to address the issue of wages collectively, because the wage, it's more homogeneous. Let's say the minimum wages of the countries producing, let's say, garments or whatever, say Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. If these countries can come into an agreement of a minimum wage, this is the wage that they are going to pay, and therefore the prices should come up to this level. So probably trying to set the price, we have to move away from trying to set the prices, address the issue of wages in the global south, and so there I can conclude there, and just to try to clarify about the numbers. So we have to pay. Why I'm saying it come to the interest payments and the bond will come to, it is actually 1.85 billion for the ISDs and the bilateral debt if we have to service the interest on the bilateral. And if you're saying, look, we don't have to service the interest on the bilateral, that will be great, then of course that will be a violation of the comparability of treatment. If they have accepted, then good, because I consulted with the second time, they didn't give me a straight answer. But then again, if we...
I think we can go back to the subject, please.
Yeah, I think we're going back to the previous question now. So we'll stick to the development consensus concept and go to Dr. Weerakoon.
Yeah, I'm going to be very brief. I can see that the audience is waiting to ask questions, and we haven't given them any time at all. I listened to Dr. Corea giving a speech in 1995 when the WTO was established. And I got the sense he was rather pessimistic that the WTO would provide the institutional structure for developing countries to come together. The one world, one system that the WTO introduced, which was to democratize the multilateral system. He thought that that's going to work against consensus building, and I think he was right. Because if you look at the Doha development agenda, that collapsed because the special and differential treatment that was to have come through, didn't come through. But when you look at the developing countries, they broke into so many splinter groups and fragmented. So I think it is it's a good principle to strive for, but I don't necessarily believe that developing countries are willing to put aside their national interests and come together. And I'll take wages. There was a proposal for migrant workers to agreement across countries that these are the minimum wages for house basis. Developing countries couldn't come to any agreement because they said, okay, if Sri Lanka doesn't want to send at those rates, we are willing to. So it's in practical terms very difficult. And today I think we need to really shift the discussion away from what's sort of worked in the past and look at Trump. What is Trump bringing to the international global order? Complete disorder. We're not even talking about unity amongst developing countries. We have to look at what the advanced countries themselves will not have any unity, because there will be the Europeans versus the American agenda, and so much has changed that the idea that developing countries can somehow overlook all of this and come together broadly on multiple issues. I don't think, maybe on single issues they may, but I'm very pessimistic, and I do apologize for finishing on that pessimistic note.
Well, I'm half so glad. You know, Dr. Corea's vision for a new international economic order, if I may call that IEO 2, I think we got to IEO 1.5. Not that we haven't made progress. The G7 share of global GDP was close to 60% at its peak. It's now down to 28%. Asia's share of GDP has now gone over 50%. China and India alone contribute something like 60% to growth, to the increment, the delta. So that was not happening in Dr. Corea's working life. Right? So it has changed. So two things. One is China's entry into the WTO, it became the world share of the world. The second thing is, in about 1992, I saw that Professor Meghnad Desai, Marxist by conviction, he had set up a Center for Globalization at LSE. He was heading it, and he was giving a lecture. So I went to attend the lecture, expecting him to have a devastating critique of globalization. He said, this is the chance for the developing world. International capital does not see nationality, it does not see caste, it does not see creed, it just wants to make money. If we get ourselves lean and mean, money will come. And that's what happened. Right? That's what has happened in the last 20, 30 years. So that's how Asia basically has done what it has done. But we missed out. When I was in the Central Bank, we used to go to Washington twice a year for the annual meetings of the annual bank and the spring meetings. And the Asia Pacific department there used to have a presentation on the region. One of the slides was Asia Pacific countries which have IMF programs. I should say Pakistan is not in the Asia Pacific region, but they didn't want to do it there, so they've gone off as well. So in the whole region, most of the 3.5 years I was in the central bank, only one country on the list. Sri Lanka is the only country with an IMF program. Nobody else. Mongolia briefly because they had a commodity show, but they came off. No other country in Asia, mostly IMF. We are the only, other than Pakistan and Asia. Why is it? That's not this. If the system is so bad, why is it the rest of Asia like that? The system is bad. Please don't let them. But what I'm saying is there are countries who figured it out. And have done a lot better than we have. Now, I could tell you the whole genesis of the debt story. I'm not going to do that. That's how we got into the problem. How we could have avoided actually going bankrupt. We could have done that. But anyway, that's for another day, or unless somebody in the Q&A wants to talk about it.
Thank you to all the panelists, Dr. Weerakoon, Dr. Coomaraswamy, and Dhanusha. Thank you very much. Now, we'll open it up to all of you. You may have a question or you might want to make a comment. Please keep your questions and comments brief. We'll take 3 at a time. Whoever wants to start off, floor is yours.
Just an observation. There was some argument about there was some discussion about what would be the value of cars that are imported if you open it out. You must also remember that the taxes on cars in Sri Lanka, roughly you could say, you take the international price and multiply it by 3, you get the domestic price. So if there's 1.6 million in cars imported, there will be $3.2 billion of additional taxes collected by the government. In rupees, no doubt, not in foreign currency, but that's the simple number, right? So you can't really talk about buying saving the money for I'll make that point. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else?
I can loudly talk. You know, I was surprised. I didn't hear anything about BRICS that you mentioned about BRICS. Dr. Vagisha, I was surprised. BRICS, China are not words are taboo generally, but fortunately, my good friend Indrajit mentioned about China. But BRICS, emergence of BRICS, and in the context of, like you told us talking about the developing countries, so South. What do you think would be the impact on us and what will be the Sri Lanka's position? Because that is the question that you raised, but I didn't hear anybody hearing that.
Thank you for backing me up on that. Maybe we'll close off with that. I'll put it to all the panelists at the end. Thank you for that. Anyone else? Yes.
I think at the moment, I think the COP29 is happening. This is another public good and global market failure that is happening at the moment. So, based on the work that Korea had done, I think on the commodity crisis in the 1970s, had he been alive today, how he would respond to the climate change crisis? So there again, I think this resource goes from the developed countries to the developing countries is being questioned. This 100 billion base kind of flow, I think, has been reached only last year, I suppose, and the global climate finance architecture hasn't been put in place, and this loss and damage fund, I think, hasn't been properly set up. So how would somebody like Dr. Corea would have responded to this crisis, which is currently going to?
Thank you for that question. I think Dr. Corea's work on environment, we didn't cover it today, but I'm not going to respond to your question. Perhaps one of the panelists might pick it up, but I just want to share a comment that Dr. Corea made after the Paris negotiations. When people asked how did it go after all the rounds and rounds of negotiations and dialogue, he said, we debated about the size of zero. that was his response. But any of the panelists want to take up that question?
Well, just to say, I think, Dushni, please comment. But my knowledge of Dr. Corea is such that he was very preoccupied with public goods, both at the national level and global public goods. So I think, there's certainly the proceeding in COP would have been of great interest.
Any other comments, observations, reflections? It doesn't have to be limited to what we discussed today. I mean, we focused on world trade, debt, and South-South cooperation, three themes that emerges from Dr. Corea's work and also quite important for our current context, not only in Sri Lanka, but elsewhere as well. But any other thoughts? You're welcome to make any contribution that we haven't covered. Yes, Dr. Chandra.
No, just one. Why didn't we, at one point, when the markets were about half the price of ISPs, wouldn't we have got somebody to buy the whole lot? I mean, some country or good country to buy it at, say, 50%, and that would have solved all our problems. Why didn't we think about that?
The thing is, you have to buy the whole thing in one shot.
Yeah.
Because if somebody is willing to give you the money to do that, you can do that. But otherwise, once you start buying, price
I
goes.
agree.
Yeah.
One shot, everybody.
Yeah.
You go to the market. It's
I
like
don't know who
it's like a
gives the money to
takeover.
do
It's
that.
like a takeover bid. You put a takeover bid at
Yeah.
50%. Everybody should.
Yeah.
You know.
But I
Why
think
did we
if
do
to
that?
find the money to do that. I'm not quite sure who was going to give us the money.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for raising that. Because Ecuador did something like that actually. Sri Lanka could have got a much more significant reduction of the cost. In early April, the price of the bonds fell to 93%. Like selling at 7%, then again shot up to like 50%. Right now it's trading around 55 cents. So yes, that strategy could have what the central bank back then did, they allowed the private banks to go and buy. So now the private banks are backing up this debt deal because they accumulated the bonds at half the price. Now they're pushing the bond deal because they'll be actually benefiting
Banks plus others.
Huh?
Banks plus others.
Plus others, which you would know. So they are so this is a massive bracket, that's what we have to understand. Because there are significant, a portion of the Sri Lankan elite who is going to benefit out of this ISB deal. Because they are owning $1.8 billion of ISBs, which they bought at less than 50% of the price during COVID. So there was a restriction on the banks by the central bank issued as far as March 30 or something 2020 because of COVID. They restricted the banks going and buying these bonds. And after 3 months, Professor W.D. Lakshman allowed the banks to go and again buy. And during this period, they accumulated, they just ran up and then bought all these bonds. But right now, it's at like we call that break-even level because even now it's like 55% of the price. So now they're not making the profit. Once the deal is struck, now today I think Fitch Ratings had put out a press release or something, communication saying that banks will be now strengthened. It's saying the same thing in different words, that banks will be strengthened after this ISB deal is struck because they bought this at very low prices.
Thank you. Since we didn't engage a lot in terms of the South-South Cooperation, and I see Dr. Arya Singha in the audience, so I will take my referee privilege and invite your comments because one of your excellent articles is in also this book in memory of Dr. Corea.
Well, I think the point about South-South cooperation, I think it was Dr. Coomaraswamy who referred to it, was that the splintering of the South is very much the cause. I wouldn't put all my eggs in the BIMSTEC, rather the BRICS basket at this point, because now the BRICS basket as it is now presently constituted, and if it is to expand, has a whole mix of characters who among themselves to sort themselves out. They will balance each other, but whether smaller countries like Sri Lanka are going to benefit from it remains a question. So I think what we should be looking from BRICS is more sectoral. What is it that we can get through BRICS? And in that some way connects to what Dr. Gamani Corea was talking about, that rather than go for the whole big deal, then you try to have chunks of it. Whether it's commodity prices, whether it's about debt, you try to get micro understandings. And there we might be able to find some reconciliation among countries. But I don't think that by any means we can think that BRICS is going to solve the problems, because I think it just got a little more complicated.
Always a voice of reason. Thank you very much for that very pragmatic answer. Anyone else? Going once? Twice? Okay, I think we can end our discussion. Oh, there is one. Harindra, go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Coomaraswamy kept inside the question how we got into the net crisis. You said you can talk about how we got into the
Perhaps this is something you can bilaterally take outside of the meeting, because this will take at least an hour.
I can just do 3 bullet points. One is, when we were a low-income country, the World Bank used to organize a donor meeting every year, and our external financing gap was filled through concessional money, mainly from the IDA and ADFs. They're very concessional money, when it became unsustainable, it was sent off the IMF program. It all kind of worked along. Then we graduated to middle income administrators and no longer had access to concessional money. What we did was we replaced that trip every year to the 8th group meeting to raise the external financing gap funding by issuing an ISBFBA to fill that gap. But what we didn't do was to understand fully that there was a different paradigm. We were exposed to rating agencies and we had much higher, much tougher terms in terms of the financing, and we didn't adjust. We didn't adjust to the new paradigm. We discovered that around 2017 began to change. Mangasamana began to run some primary surpluses. The government produced a national export strategy. So the idea was run primary surpluses in the budget, get non-decorated flows up, and over time wean yourself off this commercial borrowing. But then in the policy reversal, pandemic came, everything else.
Thank you. On that note, I think there's a lot to discuss on origins of the debt crisis. Maybe we can do it after the proceedings. Thank you very much to all of you for coming today despite the rain and for your active engagement. And thank you to BCIS, Amali, Prem, and everyone else for organizing, putting together this very stimulated discussion.
Sorry about the weather, we can't control that. But thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Vagisha, Dhanusha, Indrajit, and Dushni. That's the end of this now. Third day of the Festival of Ideas. We're going to have another one next Friday. And also we have an exhibition that is going on in the Olympus Auditorium. Tomorrow the exhibition will also be there for this week, and next week we will also have another exhibition in the Olympus Auditorium in addition to all the other sessions on Friday. So see you at some other venue. Thank you.